I would like to welcome our panel today, our presenters. We have Ann Dale, RekarMunro, and Jennifer Walinga, who are presenting Collaboration in the 21st Century, Research, Business, and Civil Society. Please be aware that this session is being recorded, and it'll be available on the Research Speaker Series on the website if you want to refer to it later. Thank you.
Okay, we want this to be dialogue and informal, so I'm just going to do a brief introduction followed by my colleagues. And it's sort of based on research, Canada Research Chair and observations meetings. It's not rigorous science by any means, but I thought in the interests of sharing where we may be going a little in the next couple of years that we do it. So we live in a world, as none of you are surprised, of messy, wicked problems. And technology even makes it difficult sometimes. There we're going. Okay, thank you. Some of these messy, wicked problems, and that's a quote from Paquette, a public administrator, is climate change, natural resource limits, population demographics, rising healthcare costs, etc., etc., etc. So what we're arguing today is all this demands kind of different ways of operating in research, business, and in our personal lives. An example of a very messy problem that's going to be emerging is something I learned from a Chinese delegation in Ottawa that I had the privilege of working with. By the year 2018, there will be 30 million more male Chinese aged 18 to 30 than women. That's the population of Canada.
50%.
30 million. And the cross-border sex trade has already started. It's a sleeper. It's a problem. It's huge. So what does this mean for research? It means interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary research. It means multi-stakeholder processes, because no one sector, no one discipline, no one group of people can solve these messy, wicked, interrelated problems. Networks are fundamental to their implementation of any solutions that we identify. Social innovation. And in my field, we have not connected the social innovation literature to the sustainability literature. And this is where you really get, if you want to implement it deeply in society, you need to get into that kind of stuff, social innovation. Dialogue. And dialogue is different now. It's not prescriptive like we in the environmental movement used to do so long ago. I have the answer, and this is the problem, and this is how we're going to fix it. It's emergent dialogue. It's dialogue where you bring the stakeholders, the practitioners, the experts together, and you discuss the problems, the solutions to the problems emerge from the dialogue, from all of those different disciplines, all of those different perspectives being brought together. And what's it all got in common? Collaboration. So we have to find even more sophisticated ways of collaborating and working together. And most importantly, it has to be authentic. People want to have access to the people who are actually working in the area. One of my closest colleagues at UBC, for example, has his research assistant blogging for him. That's not authentic. People want access to him, his knowledge, his expertise, and maybe he's got a bit of wisdom. So all of this has kind of come out of my sustainable infrastructure work, where the economist who was working on that with us said, he was shocked. Our biggest finding, 95% of the most successful and innovative sustainable infrastructure projects were private-public sector partnerships. 95% were private-public sector partnerships. And it makes sense, doesn't it? Because then you're spreading the risk. You're bringing the diverse expertise in to try to solve some of the fundamental problems. So I don't know who's next. Who wants to? Caroline.
Oh, great. Good. Thanks, Anne. And welcome, everyone. It's good to see so many people here. Collaboration. I want to first thank all of you for being part of a 2-year collaborative process with me. As you know, I've been working on Generation Y and multi-generational differences, and how Gen Y specifically will be affecting the leadership roles as they move into management positions. And many of you have contributed so significantly to my research through readings and just your own personal stories and insights. What was interesting is for the last year I've had the opportunity and the privilege to take a lot of my research to conferences. Pedro's been very patient with me leaving for conferences here and there. What's been very interesting is as I've been presenting my research around Generation Y and how they're going to impact the workday as they move into these leadership roles, what I'm finding is there was such a guttural reaction as to what Gen Y is going to do to the work environment. And in reality, when we chop down all of the emotions that people have around the next generation coming into the workplace, what I found is that there was a common thread. We really do want to collaborate and work with each other. We really do, the essence. So of all the 4 generations of the workplace, from traditionalists and boomers to X's and Y's, it's there as a thread. The difficulty is that we haven't, from what I'm seeing in the workplace, we haven't spent sufficient time exploring what specifically that looks like. We talk about collaboration. We say we want meaningful collaboration, but we don't talk about what that looks like as a reality. So a lot of what we're hearing in the workplace when we come together as a group like this, representing so many generations, is there isn't sufficient discussion around our process and what that collaboration truly means and how we value it. What I often hear from X's and Y's, and X's are those people that are in their 30s, and the Y's, the young generation in their 20s, which tend to be the generation getting a lot of airplay right now simply because of their very radical approach to how they move into the work world. And baby boomers, those born in 1946 to 64. I'm a declared baby boomer, so I'm sitting on that fence with great pride. But what I often find is baby boomers, and I don't mean to stereotype, this is just what I'm hearing as the common language at the table, is that baby boomers are often identified or perceived as wanting to dominate conversation and giving credibility to those with credentials and lots of life and work experience, and tending to sometimes be perceived as railroading the discussions with their own ideas. And Gen X's and Y's are wanting a voice very badly at that table. They're often perceived as not being able to get space or carve out space for themselves to hear their ideas and their suggestions actually voiced. What we also have is that's the face-to-face challenge, and at the same time X's and Y's are even struggling to want to join our organizations to begin that collaboration because they're perceiving a lack of social networking opportunities. And I met with over 500 Gen Ys in the course of the last few years, and about 80% of them were saying in the first week they are able to size up the technological sophistication of an organization, and of them 65% are willing to leave the organization within 3 months if the organization is not using social networking tools to communicate and to collaborate. In their view, the face-to-face meeting should have gone by the wayside 10 years ago. We should be capitalizing on text messaging and webinars and teleconferencing and audio conferencing. And that's not being done. Whereas baby boomers argue that you really can't have the richness of dialogue using those social networking tools. So we've got a real challenge in terms of those process issues. What's interesting is even though we talk about the technology differences and the differences between boomers and X's and Y's in the work world, what we often find is there isn't the process-based discussions in workplaces. We are so task-driven, we are so consumed with meeting the deadline that sometimes discussions about what we truly value and what we really need from our conversations doesn't take place. And I recall doing an activity with a ministry in Ontario. There were 85 people in the room, each representing different generations. And I divided the groups according to their self-identified generation, X's, Y's, boomers, and traditionalists. And I asked them their small groups to discuss what is it about collaboration that they value? What is it that they expect when they walk into the room around the collaboration and the conversation? And then I asked them, what do you want other people to know about how you communicate and would like to be honored at the table? And after each group had their conversation, I mixed the groups up. So now in the second division of groups, there were members of X, Y, boomers, and traditionalists sitting together. And what really was interesting is similarities surfaced, which people didn't realize we had, because I think we've done a lot of injustice understanding the multi-generations in the workplace. We've now labeled people to a point, that's a boomer, that's an X, that's a Y, when what's more important is understanding what brings us together. So for them to be able to see the similarities and the fact that they do all value collaboration, but also the differences, and to have the conversations, what can we do to start honoring differences at the table? And so what emerged is what I'm now working on as part of a paper are what I call the 20 nuggets of beginning the process for good collaboration. Now, I don't know, Anne, maybe I should just stop there, or should I?
Well, we'll leave a teaser out there.
Yeah,
Hopefully
that's what I thought.
we'll have questions and not have to wait 2 minutes. Jennifer.
I'm just going to grab something because I thought of something while you were talking.
From the little red bag?
From my big red bag. Huge. So when Anne invited me to be a part of this, I reflected on what can I possibly bring, really. I feel like I'm pretty junior at this, but as I listened and we met and chatted, I started to realize, okay, well, I'll just bring what I have. And I do a lot of research in the area of problem solving, decision making, and then the role communication can play in facilitating how we problem solve, how we just make decisions in organizations, teams, whatever. And as I'm listening to both Anne and Carolyn in our meetings, but also here, it just sparks for me little things that I've seen in the work that I've done. And I use this with students all this time, this little illustration of collaboration, really. You know, if we bring a bunch of individuals together, these are all unique individuals, and we know these principles, that if we bring them together, one by one, they can be quite easily broken, right? And you can just snap a pencil. I'm not allowed to anymore because my kids will only give me the ugly colors now because I've broken too many. But if you put them all together and try to break them, it's remarkable how much stronger they are together, right? And even just 3 pencils are incredibly strong. So you can try this at home and see and feel that. It's incredibly strong considering there's only 3 really. But why? Like, what are the principles that are in operation there? I'm asking. Not rhetorically. What is it that's going on that makes that Gestalt kind of principle, the sum being greater than or the whole being greater than the sum of the parts? How does that work? What's going on?
Load distribution, sharing the load.
Sharing the load, yeah, and what else do you see there?
Similar shapes.
But different, right? Separate but similar, sure. Wouldn't really work if one was all crooked, you know. But this is stronger than, remember those red pencils you got in grade 1, the big fat pencil, right? You can break those fairly easily. This is about the same size, but very difficult to break. What else is going on?
Each one's supporting each other.
Yeah, there's support, but there's also pressure, right? There's that tension there, interacting forces. My husband's a builder, he's like, duh. A big beam isn't as strong as several 2x4s put together, right? Because they're interacting. and there's collaboration. We know this stuff, right, mentally here, but in here, what's getting in the way? And so my big question in all the research I do is, what are we afraid of? What scares us about collaboration? What are we going to lose? What are we going to gain? Why do we silo? What's going on there? What are we really afraid of? And I think we ask that question and people just go, yeah. They don't actually answer it. What are we actually afraid of? So my next big question for you, what scares people about collaborating?
Loss of control.
Loss of control. We're very control oriented. Control becomes the focus of our goal, hey, to gain control. We lose sight of the problem we have been trying to solve. What else? What are we afraid of?
You might do it wrong.
You do it wrong. Might not work. Might fight.
Loss of assigned value. Who gets ownership, who gets rewarded for the outputs.
Or who gets blamed.
Or blamed. Half full, half empty.
Everything she said.
Professor Morrison, any comments? No?
Time to decision.
Right. It might take too long. Right.
We need to be very well aligned, and it's difficult for people to get properly aligned.
Right, that takes work right there, right? It doesn't work if it's not aligned. That takes energy, takes work, takes time. Okay. Now, if we keep drilling and actually answering those questions, so what's so bad if it takes a long time? Well, that'll impact, whether we get to move forward, or it'll take time away from something else maybe. And if we start to explore those, they become little problems in themselves. But sometimes if we keep going, and what I'm finding is if we keep going and drilling down further, those little problems start to be more easily solved than the big one of collaboration. So if we drill it down and actually lay on the table what it is we're afraid of, oh, well, we can solve that. We can come up with a process like open space that's actually really efficient. It takes 20 minutes to get to a decision. So that's what I have to offer.
If your whole challenge occupies 100% of the spectrum, and you find a way to deal effectively with 25%, then what happens is the 25% then becomes lost, because the 75% immediately becomes 100% of the challenge with which you're dealing. And I'm not convinced that by deconstructing the overall challenge that you actually do save time. And if you can find a way to deal with the most important challenges, then it may well be that when you solve 50%, there's only 50% left. But people tend to regard what's left as big a process challenge as what you've already solved.
And I think that then leads us to this idea of common ground, finding common values. And for me, it's about framing the problem correctly to begin with, because that the 100% one that you describe at the beginning, or even the 25% might not actually be the problem if we can find some common ground. Again, then we're afraid that it'll take too long, but I don't think it has to take very long. In the work that I've done with groups, you can ask those simple questions. Well, what bothers you about that? What's the problem with that? What's the problem with that? 3 layers down, you've arrived at something that's more fundamental, and it's fundamental to everybody. And then you're actually solving the correct problem, or actually what it turns into is you're building the common value you all share.
And I think with respect to messy, wicked problems, you need to have them implemented at a much wider scale than we've looked at before. And Jennifer's observation about framing the question, in my work with the management of used nuclear fuel, leading the dialogues on that, the government very wisely has limited that to the management of used nuclear fuel, because it's so contentious, the whole issue of nuclear energy in general. But we are stalemated on it, that is the most conflictual, value-laden issue I've ever worked on, and the stakeholders are very sophisticated. There's also been a failure of the hard sciences, with all due respect, to communicate the aspects of risk. And so we stay mired in conflict, and we have over 68 hockey pools of used management fuel, of nuclear fuel sitting there. So I don't think we're saying that this is the panacea for all problems, but particularly when we're dealing with the type of large-scale social issues, if you want to move beyond conflict to implementation, I think these are some of the things that we have to start considering.
And on that note, I think one of the biggest fears we have is of systems thinking, that we think we can't have a triple bottom line, or we can't have multiple stakeholders, or the 100%, like there's no way we can come to a solution that will satisfy everybody. But if we actually brought people to a common place of humanity, that's fairly simple and clear.
And just to add to that, where we often get stuck in the conflict is that we put our personalities on the table as well as the issues. And this is easy for me to say, but it's tough, I think, for us to do. Put the issues on the table. Argue the issues, not the personalities. And I know, Brian and I sat at the bargaining table for 16 months across from a very admirable team with Steve and Pedro and our mentor here is Rick. And that was fundamental to good bargaining, being able to make sure that it never got personal. And Charles is here. My apologies. Charles was on the team as well. And just being able to not get personally involved and have your heart and soul on the table, but the issues. Because I think then you can argue the issues without anything else conflicting what you're really trying to achieve at the end of the day.
Well, I think we also have very little experience. I think our tendency is either process or task. And so people who are wanting to focus on task, and we all have to do it at some point, going like, oh God, here we go with process again. Or people who are in process going, oh God, here we go with task. And we have very little experience of skillfully marrying those two, so one doesn't preclude the other. And so I think we end up in this sort of dichotomy, and we don't have a lot of practice in that. The messy, wicked problem of combining task and process in a way that honors both.
Oh, Robin, that's a rich piece to work with, because that's been the struggle predominantly for the last 20, 30 years, and we're still wrestling with the process task issue. And we realize the accountability that we have to the bottom line, to the competitive advantage being moving the task forward, yet still not truly understanding how the process can derail our ability to work together, to have the richness of collaboration that leads to the innovation, which then moves us into having that competitive strength in whatever business we are in, academic or non-academic. And it's just recently that we're starting to see a shift in terms of people focusing on the process. And in part what I'm hearing is that the mix of generations in the workplace as one factor is having an impact on that. Because what we're starting to see is that as we're not paying attention to the multi-generations in the workplace, we are losing them at a faster rate. And the HR studies show that it's not uncommon to do 4 or 5 rounds of recruitment before you actually find the candidate that should really sit in the role that you're looking for. And that's become the trend, Canadian and US trend.
I was going to say, Caroline, that sometimes I think we need heart and soul at the table. And the problems that we're dealing with are human problems, and humans have hearts and souls. And so while I'm not entirely convinced that there isn't a longer time to decision with collaboration, I think there's definitely less time to implementation with collaboration, because you've already predetermined a certain degree of buy-in.
I would never want you to lose your heart and soul, Leslie, and I know you've got a great one.
I won't, don't worry.
No, you won't. And I guess that's part of setting the tone for the conversation. I'm just hoping that when we get to the really sticky issues, the example that Anne gave us, and any issue where it does, it could potentially get very, very heated, that we don't get hurt. Yeah, we don't get hurt.
Well, and I think the biggest thing we're afraid of is fear. Like, we are afraid of our hearts and souls, or we're afraid of emotion. We want emotion out of our organizations. We have to be professional in these things. It's very interesting to me that that happens. But if we, again, explore why, you start to realize it's really more about weakness, or, you know, there are good reasons for being afraid of it. But once we explore what those good reasons are, we realize there are ways to achieve those goals within, but still be human, still have fears and anxieties. But it's almost like we need to evolve a little bit, you know, and get past, not past our humanness, but into it more deeply, and understand the value of it, and the purpose behind being afraid, and then how that works, and then how we can use it to actually find what's important to us, because it links directly.
I think we have Rick and then Steve, please.
I'd like to respond to Alex's comment. It's interesting. And I wonder whether, when you can solve that 25%, whether that 25% solution becomes a bit like a lubricant, you know, that can help actually move that other thing along. You know, the necessity of seeing the people who are engaged in this messy, wicked stuff, not from their positions, but that in fact, you know, from their humanness, just saying on fear. Because at that point, if we've solved 25% of it already, well, it's like a lost leader. If you've solved 25%, you can solve the rest of it. Once you have that relationship. And so, in my sense, a lot of this stuff is the willingness to take the emotional risk about relating to people that you would not normally relate to. Anne's work, you know, with the folks in the downtown east side of Vancouver is a really good example of watching people relate to each other. You know, kind of the binners and the, you know, the junkies, and you know, down in bad end of Vancouver, kind of dealing with other folks and helping to solve these very, very messy problems.
Steve and then.
Caroline, this XYZ stuff.
Z is coming. Z is coming.
Do we start at A after? But I mean, the things that you talked about as these intergenerational kind of differences, you know, as I grew up, right, I feel like I went through all of those things, you know, and maybe many of us did, where, you know, like I wasn't being listened to, I didn't have a seat at the table, nobody understood how we were communicating. I mean, I just feel like kind of all those kind of features that you described, those generations, I kind of, even as a boomer, I guess, I kind of went through all of those. And I wonder how many of those things are kind of age and experience related, and how many really are generational, but very specific to these the generation we're talking about. Can you pull those things apart?
Yeah, and thanks for that, Steve. There is a body of research that shows that there are a lot of common threads. The "I'm not heard" is a very common one that you've articulated, but there are researched differences between the generations. So I'm going to pull a few of them apart to show you. Gen Y, for example, is noted as the most entrepreneurial of the generations. By far, more of an entrepreneurial spirit in terms of doing their own thing and not being wanted to be part of a corporate environment or a hierarchy. So that is probably one of the more pronounced. They're also perceived, Gen Ys, as being the most radical in terms of their thinking. And it was rather, now, all of you may take response saying, I'm radical in my thinking and I'm a baby boomer. But Gen Ys seem to even push the limit. And how we have spoken, how one Gen Y articulated it to me, where baby boomers said, we want out-of-the-box creative thinking, Gen Ys want to, the expression was, burn the box and recycle the ashes. So in terms of their thinking, they're even pushing the limits even more, and it includes the social networking, the opportunities to use the networking. Now that's the obvious difference, is the technological savvy. Now some of us in the room may argue, as boomers and X's, we have been keeping up with the technology, and that's wonderful. But Gen Y prides itself in just being able to push the limits even further. And another difference is in terms of written communication. Gen Y is more likely wanting to abolish a lot of the policies and procedures that baby boomers have pride themselves on establishing. Baby boomers, looking at a generation, were the ones that gave us the richest policies, procedures, legislation for the workplace. And a lot of that came out of collective actions. When we look at disability language, disability management, gender issues, discrimination, harassment, the whole gamut, baby boomers were noted for that. So, and then Gen Y is also known as being far more concerned with and interested in, how do I say this tactfully? They're more concerned with collaboration that's done in a way that honors authenticity. So they are, more than any other generation, looking for a deeper and richer understanding of authenticity, the realness of individuals. They are less tolerant of the facades that boomers, and they are also perceiving X's have established. That business facade, the business etiquette, they'd like to scrap it all. So those are just a couple of the differences, but the big one being technologically savvy more so than any other, and the entrepreneurial spirit.
It sort of builds on what you're saying, Carol, because I think the other thing that happens around collaboration, I observe, is that even if we're focusing on process, we're focusing at the individual level. So what's this sort of, how is this team collaborating? And rarely are the structures questioned. And the reason I ties into Gen Y is because, you know, it's like we're talking collaboration, but the institutional structures are old structures, which don't necessarily tend to either support or value collaboration as it's really operationalized, you know. So it may talk collaboration, but the reward systems, the interface, all those structural pieces are very much centered in an old model. So, and Gen Y, and others probably, but Gen Y is saying the structures don't work, which is part of the reason they're entrepreneurs, right? It's like, whatever, we don't want to work in that kind of way. And it is, so the collaboration piece does require shifts at a structural, institutional level that I think are then, you know, if you're talking about messy, wicked problems, that in itself becomes a messy, wicked problem, because it's really a more fundamental shift than just asking for teams to collaborate or academics to collaborate or whatever. Is that you start, it reminds me of the Atleos when they were talking, Marlene was talking, it's like you can't fix this with the same structures. You can't expect the kind of collaboration that those kinds of problems require using structures that are inherently not geared to support collaboration.
Yes, and I was just reading on the weekend, there's a workforce study that came out in 2010 and was asking CEOs and human resources practitioners about such thing. And 14%, and the sample, we're talking about 3,000 that were surveyed for this, 14% of the CEO and the HR population saw that their organizations were ready for change of that magnitude, and only 38% of organizations were taking into consideration workforce and how it impacts business strategy. And a lot of that was the policies and procedures. And a lot of Gen Ys are, because I asked them at one point, what do you need? What is it that we're not doing that you really need in the workplace? Because we can't attract them, we can't retain them for longer than a year. That's the new dynamic. And one concern that was raised is that we don't have the voice, and where they want the voices to be able to sit on tables that are decision-making tables. They like to sit in on strategic planning initiatives. They like to sit in, and baby boomers took, quite a stab to the vein on this one, because they thought, how dare we put a young person who knows very little into those very important positions. And 81% of Gen Ys in Canada, from my own research, had said, I may not be able to offer something that's going to propel this organization into the next decade, but I might be able to question what's being done in a thoughtful enough way that may get us thinking about the changes that need to take place in our systems.
And in terms of the structure, Robin, we wrote in 1995, we know enough now to act in sustainable development. We have enough science, we have enough information, and in spite of the wealth of research and activity in the civil society leadership, we've achieved very little. And, as my colleague at UBC, Robbins, has said, it's about changing the rules of the game. And then how do you change the rules of the game and make them adaptive? But I think we also, in terms of collaboration, we have to be and I think there's a whole research agenda too to build on what you were saying in terms of evaluation measures for what's called soft processes. I'll never forget when we were creating the National Roundtable on the Environment and the Economy, and I happened to see one of my colleagues' briefing books, and he said, you can't, there's no way to quantify any of these outcomes. There's nothing you can do. And here's the complexity of it. So we actually did, one guy sitting in a bar in St. Andrews, New Brunswick, head of a private waste management company, got together with the Director General of Waste Policy and Environment Canada, and they came up with, so as a result of that social connection, a relationship building, all soft stuff, fuzzy stuff, right? They actually came up with a national waste management strategy for this country. But it never saw the light of day. And it didn't because the Canadian Councils of Ministers for the Environment squashed it. Once again, the messy, wicked problem of federal-provincial relationships, power and control, that you can never get over. And I don't know, Jennifer, from your experience, if you want to, how do you build teams and get over the sort of the individually your and move to a collectivity? Or, I don't mean to put you on the spot.
Well,
From sports,
yeah, I think, if I speak directly from the sport, and I've done some work with teams, like sports teams, around organizational change too, and the big thing that came out of it was a tolerance for a lack of control. The ones who succeed were the ones who are able to acknowledge those things we can't control. Right? So even if we talk about the structures and the context we're operating within, we're not going to change it all right now, quickly. It's going to take a while. So given that we're operating with some structures that maybe don't value or promote collaboration, how can we still promote and value collaboration? Instead of just fighting against the structures, which is very barrier focused and hammering your head against a wall, why don't we accept that which we cannot control and then understand what problems the barriers are creating and how do we solve those, right? So just shift and reframe again, I think is pretty important. Understanding, that we're human beings. You look at Kahneman Tversky's work around decision making, right? It's very emotional. They demonstrate how you frame something determines how you make a decision. That the clarity, putting the time in. Yeah, a process takes time, but understanding that the process will result in a task that's actually sustainable is critical. Putting the time in, hammering it out. You mentioned that not being able to quantify soft results, and that is the big crux, isn't it? And I think that's the big question for us. How do we tell if something's elegant and sustainable and systemic? And yet, isn't that what we want? The solutions to these really wicked problems out in the world. It's about, is it good for everyone? And people just balk at that because they think it's impossible, but it isn't.
So that comes down to evaluation.
Well, or a research program, and I think there'd be a lot of money, actually, to get a bit crass from the foundations. And I could, off the camera, I could name 2 or 3 who really would like to see research into qualitative measures and indicators for this kind of stuff. And this stuff is going to become more and more important, I think.
Well, just in terms of this conversation about the difficulties, and the federal provincial difficulties, for example. You know, I remember Paz talking about her story with Paulo Freire, and the sum of the story was, it had to do with her frustration with peasants wanting to reinvent the wheel all the time in their issues around agricultural land reform, and Freire telling Paz, putting his arm around her shoulder and saying that every person has the right to invent their own wheel. And, you know, so it was the ultimate statement about collaboration, right? That, you know, the feds would often come with a package complete, presented to the provinces. The province said, that's not my wheel. I didn't have anything to do with that wheel. Or the people who make the wheel at the Council of Ministers are not the people back in their in the capitals, and they didn't have anything to do with that. So I think that the importance of collaboration is it really reinforces that message of Paz that people who are going to be influenced by, you know, these decisions have to feel somehow that they can see a piece of themselves in a ultimate way in that business, and that we all don't want to reinvent the wheel, but we all want to have some influence over that wheel, if we're going to, which takes time, it's messy, but you know, if we can, and it comes back to something you said at the beginning, and I noted that about this collaboration, or it was Carolyn's point, that there's a lot of similarity around, and that it's the similarities around the ends, but our means may really differ dramatically, and I think that's where we end up with the problems. If we can find the commonality values, the ends, and we can work collaboratively, we can probably get over some of the means differences if we all know where there's a common set of ends to what we're trying to do.
And I think you have to be very, very clear when you have to make a decision as a leader on your own with your people. You don't pretend to go out and consult. There's a profound difference between the unilateral decision making, and they have to be made sometimes. Consultation, which is another thing. A consultation is sort of a one-off. You're trying to convince people. I tried to avoid that one, but dialogue and collaboration are also different. And you'll use those depending on the context in which you're trying to achieve something. And I think one has to be as open and transparent in it as possible.
And having the courage when you are meeting as a group that if something is unsettling, disturbing, something just doesn't hit right for you, to have the courage to know when to address that in the meeting and say, wait a minute, something in there I want to discuss, and or to know when to have the private conversation with someone to say, you know, that this was a concern or an issue for me. And something that's very difficult, because I find a lot of discussions happen after the collaboration should have taken place, known as the water cooler discussions. So everyone debriefs the meeting after the meeting, or they have the real conversation after we've left the meeting. When in reality, I think that's very revealing. What can we be doing to create the tone, the climate of disclosure, the safeness of being able to say what you need to say, even if it's going to create that polarity. And I think that you raised the leadership piece, and Jen, I know you can speak to this one as well. Sometimes it's leading by example, and as the leader being able to say, you know what, I'm uncomfortable with what just landed on the table, and I want to discuss it. I think that sets a whole different norm, because here, other places, I find sometimes a lot of conversations take place that really should have been from the larger group.
That is a focus, a shift in focus, without losing task, a shift in focus to process. If you have more of these, just what you were saying, Anne, if you, it seems like we glom onto one. It's like, okay, now we're all about collaboration.
Yeah.
All right, not that we have any shared understanding of what that means. And I can speak, even in our own program, we had collaboration going on, and you could tell, for years, it's like, we never had the discussion of what does collaboration mean to you? What does this look like to you? And you could tell that it looked like something quite different for every person who was collaborating. So I think having those kinds of discussions and having more processes and skill at those processes so that you can draw the ones that make sense in that moment. So it's not only I do this, I do appreciative inquiry, I do collaboration. It's like you got to do a lot of those things depending on what the task and the moment requires. And so I come back to, I don't think we have a lot of facility at that, perhaps world-wise, but certainly culturally. We spend very little time on figuring that piece out and learning those skills and learning how technology now interfaces or intersects with those skills, because there are different ways, it's not just that technology is supporting different ways of collaborating, it's creating different opportunities for collaboration. I mean, you see that in the way technology is being used. We're doing a session on crisis mapping, and it's a new, it's afforded through the technology. The technology is afforded a different way of collaborating in crisis situations, with mapping and cell phones and the ways in which people can collaborate towards an end. And I think, again, if you come back to a generational difference, I think there's part of that's the difference is that we're not exploring, we sort of look at technology as a tool as opposed to also something that's actually affording different meanings to what collaboration is, or dialogue, or whatever it is that you're looking at.
And Gen Y doesn't even think of the technology as a tool as we do. They think of it as their way of life.
Yes.
It's just part of it. Yeah, it's their way of life.
I think it's important what you said about the need for training in a new mode of discourse, because academics especially are trained to debate, to argue, to have a zero-sum kind of approach to communication, right? So somebody has to be wrong and somebody has to be right. And add that to the fact that most collaboration that I know of takes place in a hierarchical institution where there's a lot of energy put into maintaining good relationships with bosses and reports. Those are complicating factors. I think even if people had a little training on how do you actually use your voice and body when you're in collaboration with people, when you hear that zinger coming across the table that you normally would respond to with defiance or hurt, like how do we actually do this differently?
Yes.
Right? And the situations I've been in where collaboration works, there was a lot of attention paid at the beginning of the workshop or the day on how to say this, how to talk, how to do the talk. And I fear we're just, I don't know about Gen Y because I don't have children, but I know my generation was taught that a rational person is a debater, looking for the truth, right? And it belongs to people, and that means it doesn't belong to others.
I thank you for mentioning that. And in the last year, I've heard more people in business comment that we need to use less judgmental and evaluation in our line of inquiry, and more asking questions from a place of curiosity and wanting to know and to enrich our understanding. I'm amazed at how many have been able to pull that into the conversation. You know what, for me, that's often the telltale sign of a group that works well together, is one where the questions are now not with that leading or that evaluation. It's now about, I want to know more, because that's where the essence of real learning occurs.
I saw Amy Zadulka making the 6 hats, Edward de Bono's 6 different. She said, if we're doing de Bono, I may as well make silly hats for all of us to wear, because academically we get that evaluation is just one kind of thinking, but if you can actually take your black hat off, which is the evaluation hat, and put on your yellow hat, that's the kind of training that I think we just kind of gloss over and think because we understand it intellectually and we know how to do it.
There's one tool as well, and it's called values articulation. And so at the beginning of a meeting, particularly when you're dealing with community groups, is you try to get people to articulate their values so you know where you're coming from. And once you get those values articulated on the table, they don't keep popping up through all of the solution or the content that you're trying to drive. And so that's where you spend a lot of time on process. And I just want to finish with a funny little story. When I first started to work with academics at the National Roundtable on the Environment and the Economy, I couldn't understand the meeting dynamics because it was sort of I sometimes wish we weren't videotaped, but it's sort of like it's my framework and not your framework. So then I quickly built into agendas at least half a day to decide on the agenda and the framework. And I knew that that was a lost leader. 3 to 4 hours had to be spent on this kind of whose framework is superior to each other's framework. And I think we maybe when we start surfacing some of, and as you said, some of our, if it's not my knowledge, it's my answer and it's not your answer. We live in the world of and now, so it's both answers. And at Royal Roads, our cohort model is based on the belief that the group always outperforms the individual, and we've seen the power in that. And why I think collaboration is particularly important in an academic setting is because it's the sharing of intellectual capital that drew us all here. And yet we spend so very little of our time engaged in that. And today is hopefully some small part of what we were trying to show. And I think it's really important just in terms of having fun. Imagine.
It's being able to check assumptions along the way as you're collaborating. And I'm probably going to regret this example as well, but I remember walking into a group with Gen Ys, and there were about 20 of them in the room, and that wasn't having my most stellar, wonderful day. And I remember this one gentleman, just threw out a comment to me, says, "Carolyn, you're looking fat today."
Oh,
and I went, I didn't know if I should implode or explode, and I knew either one of them would look very good. And then somebody whispered to me, "Fat, P-H-A-T." And I said, "I'm still not getting it." I said, because I took F-A-T. And he said, "No, fat, P-H-A-T is cool, hip, fine, good." But checking assumptions before we implode or explode at the table, yes. Never taking them home with us.
So now we can save you in the hallway?
No, you still can't say
How do you look bad?
because I don't know if you're talking about P-H-A-T or F-A-T. And I don't want to know the answer. Yeah, but it's checking assumptions along the way. Because there's that word up there around authenticity. I don't think we can move at that macro level and make change on the levels that we're expected to until we start at the very grassroots.
And I would say the quickest link to values is fear. If you go around that table and say, "What are you afraid of losing?" They'll say this, and then because this is what I'm protecting right here, it's my core on the table.
Any last questions? Peg, where you haven't asked anything?
I don't really have a question, and thank you for training us. It's just that this is thought-provoking, and it has created many thoughts in my mind, but I don't know if I'm adding any value to the conversation. So a couple of comments, and I might add at least 1 cent to the conversation. I do see a significant change from generation to generation. I do see my children, particularly my 13-year-old daughter, performing, behaving, and assuming a role in society which I think is significantly different from the way I behaved when I was her age. Yeah, of course you can say that at a different gender, different time, but at a deeper level, I see her being significantly more pragmatical. Not only her generation, a little bit less ideological, and being a little bit less materialistic. I don't know if I'm using the right word. And the comment you made about how they see technology for themselves, I think that is significantly different from the way we interact with technology. And I lived one particular comment that she made when she was 5, which I might be exaggerating. It might not be as much as I might want it to be, but I took her to the doctor when she was 5 years old, and the doctor looked into her throat and she said, "It seems like we've got a virus." And she said, "Virus? I'm not a computer." And even the doctor and I took us a while to understand it. Another one is she was 4 or 5, and I picked her up at school. And she was chatting with a friend, and she didn't see me coming, and I caught a little bit of what she was saying. And she was saying, my daddy is starting to become a doctor. She was very proud. And then she changed her demeanor, and she said, but not one of those doctors that help people. So coming from a 5-year-old, I think it says much more than just those few words. Finally, again, I'm probably not adding any material to the conversation, is the issue of collaboration has to be seen and understood even from the multicultural perspective. And yes, you have interdisciplinarity, a multi-stakeholder on the board, but culture is a huge component. And I've had a chance to interact in Canada, in the US, Mexico, and a couple of other American countries, and I found Canadians, and I'm sorry if I'm being particularly bold with this one, very proud and prone to speaking about collaboration. However, collaboration might not be the easiest to trigger in Canada because of Canadians being, in general, politically correct most of the time, or kind or polite. So I found many cases where pushing individuals with those features into true collaboration has been more difficult because of a particular concern with doing or saying what is right to say. I'm not saying they should be rude, but that I feel has, in some cases, have kept them away from true and honest collaboration. I don't know if these triggers any responses from anybody, but it's a little bit of a sense of what I've seen through the years.
I think that's a little bit more than assent, and I will definitely be adding intercultural to this cloud. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, we've been criticized in the sustainable development domain for missing out power and conflict. I can only speak for my own domain. Power and conflict, gender, race, class. But there's only so much you can do in a lifetime. So Jennifer, and thank you very, very much, Carol. And
You're a
everyone
gift.
else.
We wish you to.
Everyone else. Thank you.